Welcome to Encounter, where we celebrate putting faith into action and community leaders who live out compassion, grace, and love. We're a program of the Broome County Council of Churches that addresses food insecurity through CHOW and the Greater Good Grocery, provides hospital and jail ministry, builds wheelchair ramps, and assists neighbors with transportation and shopping services through Faith in Action volunteers. We invite you to the conversation. Encounter your neighbors as we learn to walk together in love and kindness.
Good morning and welcome to Encounter. I'm your host today, Joe Sellepack, the Executive Director at the Broome County Council of Churches. I don't know how many of you are aware, but we are facing an election right now. On my drive up to the station this morning, I actually passed so many signs, all advertising who the person wanted to support within the next election in November. And then you can't turn on the television or go on social media or even look at any of the, even look at streaming services without knowing that we're in the middle of an election cycle. Everyone is vilifying one person or another. There's a stone throwing that is going on. There's all kinds of rancor and disagreements about what the future of our country is going to look like. And it seems that to me as if this is an indication of some recent data that I've been going through from the Pew Charitable Trust. They have done some work with trying to determine trust in government. This has been going on for a long period of time. 22% of people think that the government will actually do what is right. Very low numbers, historically low actually. And when we begin diving deep into that, 35% of Democrats, because the Democrats are in the White House, think that the government will do what is right. 11% of Republicans think that it will do what is right. And the result of this election will flip those numbers. We'll end up with some being on top, some being below, but no one really having an awful lot of trust that the government will do what is right. This actually is one of the reasons that we have such divisiveness and polarization within our political debate these days. Because then we end up vilifying the other person, saying they are the problem, they are the reason that we can't do what is right. And therefore, we point fingers and we cast blame. And what dies in the middle of all of that is the fact that we desperately need government to do what is right. And to help us to kind of dive deep into this political divide are two people. First is no stranger to Encounter, Douglas Taylor. He is the pastor at the Unitarian Universalist congregation in Binghamton. Welcome to Encounter, Douglas.
It's great to be here again, Joe. Thank you.
It's always good to have you back. And our other guest is first time, I believe, on Encounter. It is Dr. Don Nieman. He is a professor of history, civil rights advocate, and a Provost Emeritus. That's kind of like an interesting term right there, Provost Emeritus, at Binghamton University. And currently he's written a book, and it's just been published, just put out. It's called The Pathway to Paralysis. And it's all about the dysfunctions within our government, how it's become nasty. And there's a whole bunch of neat little words that you put underneath that. It's nasty, it's dysfunctional, and it's a threat to the republic. So thanks for being on Encounter. Thanks for being with us today.
My pleasure to be here. Thanks for asking.
Yeah. So Don, let's start off by talking a little bit about your book and about some of the things that you talked at my Rotary Club recently about, like beginning with this whole issue of it being dysfunctional and nasty. Hasn't our politics always been somewhat nasty?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. This is a big country. It's a very diverse country, regionally in terms of religion, in terms of economic interests, sectional interests, and whatnot. And so politics has traditionally been divisive in a country like this. And politicians historically have known that appeals to fear, attacks on the enemy, mobilize supporters, and are effective. So that's been a theme throughout American politics. But historically, we haven't been polarized in the way that we are today. That's something that is really different, and it's something that really has emerged only in the last 15 or so years.
So this dysfunction, where do you think that the current dysfunction, where do you place that? Like, how did we get here?
Yeah, I mean, I think, going back to your initial question about, hasn't politics always been nasty? I mean, since the late 1960s, since the upheavals of the 1960s and the conflict in the 1960s, American politics has become divided around issues of race, around issues of religion, sexuality, women's rights, issues that go really to who you are, your
Right.
identity.
Your
right?
identity, right, yeah.
And
Identity politics is huge, right?
oh, it is, and it's been it's nothing new. Certainly since the 1960s, American politics has increasingly revolved around identity.
Right.
And those identity politics can make politics particularly divisive and particularly nasty, because when politics is about identity, it's about who we are and about who those other people are. And they're different than we are. And they don't have the values that we have.
So do you think that what we're looking for in leadership is like we want to hold up a mirror and be able to see ourselves in the leader?
Yeah, absolutely.
So in a way, that's where identity politics plays out in a lot of ways. Because if the leader doesn't look like me, doesn't smell like me, doesn't have the same type of characteristics,
Doesn't speak the language that you speak.
well, yeah, exactly. Then we tend to vilify him or her. Well, it's always been him, unless they're a political candidate. Then it becomes a her.
Yeah.
in some ways, but so how did all of that coalesce within the election, like of Barack Obama? Because I think you argue that in your book,
Yeah.
and it was a big part of your presentation at Rotary too. So
Yeah, I mean, for decades, from the late 1960s to the early 2000s, our politics revolved around these identity issues. But politicians, Republicans and Democrats, fought around identity issues, but they would come together to do stuff. And there was a lot of give and take. There was a lot of compromise. There were problems that were addressed over the years. I mean, famously, Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill in the 1980s reached a major compromise to salvage Social Security. Reagan compromised with Democrats to create comprehensive immigration reform. So, for many decades, you could have the fighting, but you could also have the deal making. And the deal making allowed government to do what it's supposed to do. That is, come up with solutions. They may be imperfect, but come up with solutions to pressing problems. And I do think that with the election of Barack Obama in 2008, that ended. We came to a point where politics became polarized, and I think there are a number of things that contributed to that. Not just Obama's election. There were a lot of things in the making that contributed to it. The identity politics is certainly one thing. The evolution of media is another thing that's huge. With the beginnings of talk radio in the 1970s and the 1980s, the development of the internet in the 1990s, the emergence of social media in the early 2000s. People came to get their news from sources that confirmed their biases. They lived in information bubbles, and those information bubbles fed their own biases, portrayed the enemy as diabolical.
Right.
And that really tended to undermine compromise. I mean, another thing that happened over the course of the latter years of the 20th century and into the early 20th century, increasing resort to gerrymandering.
Yeah.
And so in the House of Representatives, for example, most people who sit in the House of Representatives come from safe seats. They have more to fear from people on the extreme of their party than they have an incentive to come to the center and compromise. That has been a huge thing. And then I think Obama's election itself convinced Republican leadership in Congress that Republicans might be relegated to kind of a permanent minority. I mean, he did win an overwhelming victory in 2008, and they decided to dig in.
Right.
And the resort to populist appeals that emerged in the 2008 election, and then certainly with the Tea Party in 2010, really furthered that. And by 2010, we found ourselves in a situation where nobody in Washington was willing to give on anything.
Right.
You know, what we faced was the issues that politicians dealt with was, were we going to keep the government open?
Right.
Would we pay our debt? You know, rather than being able to deal with major issues confronting the country, issues like immigration. Now, that's one thing where everybody agrees, I think, that we have a problem.
We do have a problem.
The challenge is nobody is willing to talk about or very few people are willing to talk about a solution to that problem.
Or if
that's the polarization that we face.
Or if they come up with a solution, there is that power that kills it.
Yeah.
So we end up not even passing any legislation because somebody who represents a person with self-interest in keeping the debate open basically suggests that we need to kill the legislation.
Yeah, and there's in this polarized environment, in both camps, on both sides of the divide, there's this sense that you have to remain true to your principles, right?
Well,
you can't move away from that.
That's the center of identity politics, right?
It is. If you budge from those principles, you have betrayed. You've gone over to the other side. And at no point in our history have issues been dealt with and resolved unless there is give and take.
Right.
It's a big country with diverse points of view on these things, and you've got to give a little to get a little, right?
Right. And so Douglas, let me turn to you.
Sure.
So it's, you know, what's really interesting to me as Don was just talking, all I could think of was church or congregations and how congregations function and how religion has functioned typically within our culture, because there tends to be this little I'm a Presbyterian, I'm a Methodist, I'm a Unitarian, I'm a Catholic, I'm a Jewish person, I'm a Muslim, and those identities become so entrenched that there's no give or take within that. Mm-hmm. How has religion kind of added to this?
Yeah, this has been a fascinating piece to hear. I've really enjoyed how this is unfolding. Religion, I also, I've been thinking about how does this play out for religions, because we spend so much time in religion. As a pastor, I'm trying to give the people in the congregation some nourishment, some sense of resilience for themselves, some sense of, you and I have talked a little bit about, like, you need to belong. You need, like, that is nobody heals alone. You got to heal in a community. Nobody gets anything done alone. You have to do things in a community. And so building community is a key piece for a religious organization. And there's an easy way to do that, which is to say, you're not a bad person like the other people are bad people. Like, that's a really cheap and easy way to do it. And I'm framing that really simplistically, and there's some incredibly nuanced ways to other people so that an individual feels good and feels like they belong. That's really hard then to turn and kind of create a congregation and a community of people of faith who will say, who allow for pluralism, who allow for, just because someone else is right doesn't mean I'm wrong. And then which I think is exactly at the heart of what is happening in our politics too, is how hard that is to say, I disagree with you remarkably, and yet I recognize that you're still human. I think that's deeply religious to be able to do that.
And there seems to be, to me, like within religion, there was the ecumenical movement, which basically suggested that we begin to have conversations across difference and dialogue. And so that became very much a part of the conversation in the 1950s and following. So there was this give and take. There was it was no longer vogue to vilify Catholics. It was no longer vogue to vilify Protestants. There was an intentional dialogue that took place, and then out of that dialogue, a lot of good things happened. We ended up forming things like the Council of Churches, which is something that we were formed in the 1950s. 1959 was when we were incorporated, and it became a part of what we do. So out of that came like our jail ministry, came CHOW, came Faith in Action Volunteers, came, it was intentionally non, in a word, to use your term, nonpartisan. Yeah. It was an effect that people gave up some of their personal identity. They didn't give up their faith. They brought their faith with them into the dialogue, but they found in that dialogue that there were a lot of commonalities that existed between Protestants, between Catholics, between Jewish people, between Muslims, and those commonalities became the thing that we focused on, not so much the differences. And because we found commonality in trying to help the poor, make racial justice an issue, that brought back some of the values that we as Americans have always had, going back to even George Washington, who would not vilify Jewish people, and because he wanted to make sure that Jewish people were welcomed within the United States as it was beginning to emerge. So let's turn back to Don. So in your work that you've done, one of the questions that comes up is like, what are some solutions? Like you suggested that Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan, even Newt Gingrich and Bill Clinton had ways of coming together to do some legislation that kind of led itself toward it. What are some hope that we can have?
Yeah, I mean it's a difficult one because it's easier to slide into this polarization than it is to get out. And I'm afraid the media environment just constantly reinforces that. I think at some level, this is going to have to take place on a macro level and on a micro level. On a micro level, people are going to have to not just talk to one another, people are going to have to listen, to open their ears and not just their mouths, yes, to get to know people on the other side. And so Douglas and I have had some association with an organization that emerged about 7 years ago called Braver Angels. And its purpose is to bring people together from Red America and Blue America, and have them listen to one another and talk to one another to get to know one another. Because I think ultimately, in our communities, in our churches, in our civic organizations, in our interactions in the community, we know we have more in common than we have that separates us, right?
And the data proves it.
Yeah.
So all you have to do is look at the data that says, if we get beyond the divide, we find that the data actually supports the fact that we all believe in fairness, equity, inclusion even comes up, and other kinds of things that we all hold as values as Americans.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, I think if we can listen to one another, that will help humanize us. We're not this other.
Right.
We're not this deep, mysterious, evil opposition. And I think if we can do that, we can recognize that, these problems really are complicated, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And there's no simple solution to them. And we do have to give a little bit away from what we see as the perfect solution to come up with something that may be workable. And so I think that organizations that bring people together, something like Braver Angels, other community organizations are one way. Another thing that gives me a little bit of hope is that, going back to, you cited a number of Pew polls, and Pew is really, really good.
Right.
It's kind of the gold standard, I think.
It really is.
In polling. And one of the things that they consistently show is that Americans hate politics. And the reason that they hate politics is because it's polarized, because of the nastiness, because of the dysfunction that it breeds. And so I think that I really believe that we're on the cusp of people saying no to the haters.
Right.
And that's what it's going to take. It's going to take people saying no to the haters, no to the people who spew lies, to bring us back to a point where we can fight with one another in a reasonably civil manner, but still leave that space where we can come together to have conversations to solve problems, and even solve them in imperfect ways.
Don, this is one of the fascinating pieces that you're lifting up about this, is that we need to figure out how to be able to come back together again and argue with each other well.
Yeah.
I read somewhere that, yes, the polarization is a big problem, and here's what the solution is. We need to argue with each other.
Yeah.
We need to have our differences and really engage with them. Somebody was saying that it's the freedom of speech that is the counterweight, not the counterweight. What is that? That keystone that fits into the arch, that pushes both sides, right, that allows the whole structure to stand. Because if it were all to be one side wins, the whole thing will just collapse. We need the differences. We need that enough conflict healthfully to engage with each other.
Yeah, and I think all of us in our professional lives, the lives we lead, realize that when we're trying to solve a problem, having different points of view helps us come up with better solutions. It doesn't necessarily make it easier,
no,
right? But
it's uncomfortable.
And it's uncomfortable, absolutely. It's much easier to go into trying to solve a problem and say, well, I know how to solve this, just get out of my way and I'll do it. But I think we all know from experience that we come to better solutions if there are different voices at the table, and even some healthy arguments.
Yeah. My thought would be that religion has a part to play within this too. I think about humility. I think about some of the great patience, forgiveness, some of the great words that kind of come from religion, that forbearance, temperance. Yeah. There's a number of words that we kind of talk about in church sometimes, but but we don't realize how relationally oriented those words are. And the fact is that in order to come into these conversations with others, one needs humility. One needs to know that we don't have all the answers. One needs to know that we can repent, and we can. One of the greatest theological words that we have around is reconciliation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And reconciliation requires difference.
Yes.
It does. And these kinds of things, these are not foreign to religion, but because we have become so entrenched within our own polity, or our own doctrine, that it has led us to the point where we don't reach out to somebody else and realize that person has a lot to offer me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. It's about who's going to win and who's going to lose, and it's about socking it to the people you don't like.
Exactly.
Irrespective of whether you accomplish anything, putting them down.
Yeah, because it's an endorphin rush to be right, to have that gotcha.
Yep.
And to prove, at least to yourself, that what you thought before is true, rather than to listen and to maybe grow a bit. Even if you don't change, by listening, you're opening yourself up to not necessarily not being right, but to understanding another person's perspective, understanding why would this person even say that or need that or call for that when that hurts me so much for them to do that. Why are they doing that?
Yeah.
Go with it. Go in with some curiosity. We talk a lot about curiosity in my congregation. It's an opening.
Yeah, and I think that, going back to, what can we do about this? We've been circling around that, and some really good ideas, I think. I think civic organizations in our community have to step up. I mean, when I spoke to your Rotary group, I made a pitch. Rotary is a perfect group to do something like to bring people together, because there are Republicans, there are Democrats there, I know. And there are other civic organizations, and I think they're the ones who have to step up to create these conversations.
My guests today have been Reverend Douglas Taylor, who's the pastor at the Unitarian Universalist congregation. Also with Don Nieman, who has written a wonderful book called The Pathways to Paralysis: How American Politics Has Become Dysfunctional and Nasty, Dysfunctional, and a Threat to the Republic. They can find your book on Amazon.
They can.
They can also go to www.braverangels.org and sign up and be a part of the conversation there as well. So thank you for being on Encounter this morning. And for all of you, I hope that you would be good and gentle with each other, be kind and considerate through this period of time, and be able to reach across the aisle and embrace someone who is a little different than you. Have a great day.